The year was 1878, and the dust of Providence was a fine, pale powder that settled on everything, a constant reminder of the town's tenuous grip on the vast, indifferent land. For Esther Weston, it was the grit she tasted in her bread, the film that clouded the rectory windows she scrubbed, and the color of her own faded hopes. An orphan since the fever took her parents on the Westward Trail 5 years prior, she had been taken in by the town, which was to say she had been given to Reverend Blackwood and his wife as a charity case, an unpaid servant whose soul was to be saved through relentless, back-breaking labor. Her life was a small, tightly wound coil of routine. Rising before the sun, she would stoke the fire, fetch the water, knead the dough, her movements practiced and silent. She moved through the Blackwoods' severe, joyless house like a ghost, her presence acknowledged only when a task was done poorly or a new one needed assigning. Martha Blackwood communicated through thin-lipped sighs and pointed glares, while the Reverend addressed her only to quote scripture related to humility and the sins of idleness. Esther had learned long ago that the best way to survive was to become as small and unnoticeable as possible, to fold herself into the shadows and pray the day would pass without incident. The loneliness was a physical thing, an ache in her chest that sharpened in the evenings when she lay on her thin straw mattress in the attic crawlspace. She would listen to the wind moaning around the eaves, a sound that seemed to carry all the sorrow of the empty plains. In those moments, the memory of her mother's hand and her father's laugh would rise up, so vivid and painful it stole her breath. They had been people of hope, full of dreams about a patch of land they could call their own. Providence had been their final, unmarked resting place, and for Esther, it was a living tomb. The townspeople saw her as a burden, a reminder of failure, her very existence a testament to the fact that dreams died easily out here. One sweltering afternoon in late August, a disruption came. It was not loud or violent, but a quiet, desperate presence at the very edge of town where the dusty street bled into the prairie. An Apache family, a man, a woman, and a small child stood beside a tired-looking pony. They were not warriors, not a threat, but simply people worn down by hunger and heat. The man, whose name was Lonan, stood with a rigid pride that did little to conceal the exhaustion in his frame. The woman, Kia, held the child, her dark eyes scanning the uncharitable faces of the townspeople who stopped to stare. They were a portrait of want, their clothes travel-stained, their faces gaunt. The reaction in Providence was swift and predictable. Doors were closed, mothers pulled their children inside. Mr. Donovan, the proprietor of the general store, emerged with a shotgun held loosely in his arms, his meaning clear without a word spoken. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, a gesture of profound contempt. The Reverend Blackwood, who had been conferring with a parishioner, stopped and watched, his face a mask of stern disapproval. He saw them not as a family in need, but as a test of his flock's moral fortitude, a temptation to be resisted. He believed charity began and ended within the church walls, and only for those deemed worthy. Esther watched from the rectory window as she polished silver. She saw the child, a little boy no older than 5, listlessly lean his head against his mother's shoulder. She saw the woman's cracked lips and the man's fierce, desperate gaze. Something inside her, a feeling she had long suppressed for her own survival, began to stir. It was a raw, aching compassion, a recognition of their suffering that transcended the town's ingrained fear and prejudice. They were hungry. It was a simple, terrible fact. She knew the risk. She knew the cost of defying the unspoken laws of Providence, but the image of the child's weary face was a hook in her heart. That evening, her hands trembled as she served the Reverend and his wife their supper of roasted chicken and potatoes. As she cleared the table, she made her decision. She wrapped a half loaf of day-old bread, 2 cold potatoes, and a thick slice of salted pork left over from the midday meal into a piece of cloth. It was more than her own portion for the next day, a small fortune of sustenance. Under the cloak of a deep, starless twilight, she slipped out the back door of the rectory. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each rustle of the wind sounding like an accusation. She scurried along the backs of the buildings, keeping to the deepest shadows, the bundle clutched tightly in her hand. The family was still there, a forlorn silhouette against the horizon. They had not been driven off, only ignored into near invisibility. As she approached, the man, Lonan, rose silently, his hand moving to a knife at his belt. His posture was that of a cornered animal, ready to defend his family to the last. Esther stopped, holding up the bundle as a peace offering. "For you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "For the child." Kia looked from Esther's face to the bundle, her expression a mixture of disbelief and profound weariness. She said something soft in her own language, and Lonan's posture eased, though his eyes remained wary, searching Esther's face for trickery. Esther took another hesitant step forward and placed the bundle on the ground, then retreated, showing she meant no harm. Kia knelt and slowly unwrapped the cloth. When she saw the food, a sound escaped her lips, a soft sob of relief. She broke off a piece of bread and gave it to the little boy, who ate with a ravenous, desperate hunger that made Esther's throat tighten. Kia then looked directly at Esther, her dark eyes holding a depth of gratitude so powerful it was like a physical touch. In that single, silent gaze, Esther felt more seen and more human than she had in 5 years of living in Providence. Lonan ate as well, his eyes never leaving Esther, but the hard suspicion in them was slowly being replaced by a grudging respect. Esther did not linger. She gave a small, jerky nod and turned, melting back into the shadows. She did not know that a pair of eyes had watched the entire exchange from the darkened window of the saloon. Walter Prescott, a man who found his pleasure in the misfortune of others, had seen it all. He smiled, savoring the trouble he was about to cause. The next morning, the reckoning came. Reverend Blackwood summoned Esther to his study before the sun had fully risen. The air in the room was cold and still. Walter Prescott stood near the fireplace, a smug look on his face. "Miss Weston," the Reverend began, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Mr. Prescott has brought a disturbing report to my attention. He claims to have witnessed you consorting with the savages at the edge of town last night." Esther's blood ran cold. She stood before him, her hands clasped tightly to stop their shaking. She could not bring herself to look at Prescott's gloating face. "Reverend, they were hungry." "Hungry?" The Reverend's voice rose, laced with incredulous fury. "We are a community of God, fearing people, surrounded by heathens and danger. Your act was not charity. It was a betrayal. You gave aid and comfort to those who would see us driven from this land. You jeopardized the safety and moral purity of this entire town." "It was only bread," she whispered, the words feeling fragile and foolish in the face of his righteous anger. "It was defiance," he thundered, slamming his hand on the desk. "It was a flagrant disregard for the order and decency we have fought to establish here. You have shown yourself to be sympathetic to the wilderness, to the godless element. Such a corruption cannot be tolerated." He looked at Prescott, who nodded eagerly. "The town council agrees. An example must be made." Esther felt a wave of dizziness. She knew what making an example meant in Providence. It meant public humiliation. It meant pain. "Please, Reverend," she begged, the last vestiges of her pride crumbling. "I meant no harm." "Your intentions are irrelevant," he said, his eyes as hard and unforgiving as granite. "The consequence of your action is what matters." He stood, his tall frame seeming to fill the entire room, casting a long shadow over her. "You will be placed in the pillory for 3 days. You will have time to reflect on your sin in the public eye, and the town will be reminded of the price of consorting with the enemy." The pillory stood in the center of the town square, a cruel wooden skeleton baking in the relentless sun. 2 men from the council dragged Esther from the rectory, her pleas ignored. They forced her head and wrists through the rough-hewn holes, the wood scraping her skin raw. The lock clicked shut with a sound of absolute finality. And so her ordeal began. The first day was a blur of shock and searing heat. The sun beat down on her unprotected head and neck, blistering her skin. Her arms, locked in their unforgiving embrace, grew numb, then throbbed with a fiery agony. Thirst was a constant torment, her tongue swelling in her dry mouth. The townspeople passed by, some with looks of pity they dared not express, others with open scorn. "There's the savage lover," one man sneered. Children, emboldened by their parents' cruelty, threw pebbles that struck her face and shoulders. Martha Blackwood watched from the rectory porch for a time, her face set in a look of grim satisfaction, before turning and going back inside. As dusk fell, the heat gave way to a biting chill. The pain in her neck and back became a grinding, constant agony. Shivering, exhausted, she drifted in and out of a feverish state of consciousness. In her delirium, she saw her mother's face, heard her father's voice calling her name on the wind. Grief, raw and overwhelming, washed over her. She was utterly alone, punished for a single act of kindness in a world that had shown her none. Despair was a cold, heavy weight, threatening to extinguish the last spark of her spirit. The second day was worse. The sun was a malevolent eye in the sky. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her vision blurred. The taunts of the townspeople became a meaningless drone. She focused on enduring, one breath at a time. During the hottest part of the day, when the square was mostly empty, she heard a soft footstep. She managed to lift her heavy head and saw Abigail Hale, the blacksmith's quiet widow, standing before her. Abigail's face was etched with a sorrowful pity. Without a word, she quickly unstopped a small flask, lifted it to Esther's lips, and let a few precious drops of cool water trickle into her mouth. It was gone in a moment, but the relief was immense, a small anchor of humanity in a sea of cruelty. "God keep you, child," Abigail whispered, before glancing around nervously and hurrying away. That small, furtive act of kindness was enough. It was a pinprick of light in the suffocating darkness. It reminded Esther that she was not just an object of scorn, but a person. She held on to the memory of the cool water, the widow's sad eyes, and it fueled a tiny, stubborn flicker of defiance within her. They could lock her body, but they could not completely crush her soul. Unseen by anyone in the town, from a low ridge overlooking Providence, Lonan watched. He had brought his family to safety and then returned, drawn by a sense of obligation he could not name. He had seen them drag her to the pillory. He had watched her suffer through the first day and the second. He saw the townsfolk's cruelty, and he saw the widow's brief, risky act of mercy. A slow, cold anger built in him. The woman had shown his family honor. These people, her people, were repaying that honor with barbarism. It was a profound imbalance, a debt that was now owed not by him, but to her. He watched until the sun set on the second day, then turned his horse and rode hard through the night. The third day dawned, and with it a sense of finality. Esther was barely conscious. Her body was a symphony of pain, her mind a fog of misery. She was aware of the sun rising, of the heat beginning to build again, but it all seemed distant, happening to someone else. She knew, with a dull certainty, that she might not survive this. Part of her no longer cared. The world had shrunk to the rough wood against her cheek and the fire in her veins. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent and painted the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple, a change occurred. A sudden hush fell over the town square. The usual sounds of wagons and voices died away, replaced by an uneasy silence. Esther, through a haze of pain, sensed the shift. She forced her eyes open, blinking against the glare. They came from the east, appearing as dark specks on the horizon before resolving into the forms of men on horseback. There were at least a dozen of them, moving with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and deeply intimidating. They were Apache warriors, their faces stern, their presence radiating a quiet, coiled power. They were led by an older man with a face like a weathered rock, his long hair streaked with gray. It was Kuruk, the chief of their band. Beside him rode Lonan, his expression hard and unreadable. Kia was there too, riding a few paces behind, her eyes fixed on the pathetic figure in the pillory. The townspeople of Providence froze. Fear, stark and primal, rippled through the square. Mr. Donovan scrambled inside his store, fumbling for his shotgun. Men who had been lounging outside the saloon stood and backed away slowly. Reverend Blackwood emerged from the rectory, his Bible in hand, his face pale but resolute. He intended to face them, to be the shepherd protecting his flock from the wolves. The riders did not stop at the edge of town. They continued forward at a steady, deliberate pace, their horses' hooves kicking up soft puffs of the dust that defined the town. They flowed around the well and the water trough, their formation unwavering, their destination clear. They stopped in a semicircle around the pillory, enclosing Esther in a ring of silent, imposing figures. The air grew thick with tension, so heavy it felt hard to breathe. Reverend Blackwood stepped forward, holding his Bible like a shield. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" he demanded, his voice straining to sound authoritative. "This is a peaceful, godly town. You have no business here." Kuruk ignored him completely. His gaze, sharp and penetrating, was fixed solely on Esther. He dismounted with a fluid motion that belied his age and walked toward the pillory. The town held its breath. Esther stared at him, a flicker of confused awareness penetrating her delirium. The chief stopped directly in front of her. He looked at her blistered face, her swollen wrists, the raw, chafed skin of her neck. He looked at the discarded pebbles on the ground around her. His expression was grim, a deep disapproval etched into the lines of his face. He said something in his language, a short, sharp command. One of the warriors dismounted, a heavy hatchet in his hand. He walked to the side of the pillory. The townspeople gasped, thinking he meant to kill her. The reverend cried out, "In the name of God, stop!" But the warrior paid him no mind. With a single powerful blow, he struck the thick wooden bar of the lock. The wood splintered, and the lock burst open. The warrior swung the top half of the pillory upward, freeing Esther's head and hands. Released from the agonizing posture she had held for 3 days, her body had no strength left. She crumpled forward, a dead weight, and would have hit the ground had Lonan not moved with startling speed. He caught her, swinging her limp form into his arms, as if she weighed nothing. At that moment, Kia was there, pushing a waterskin to Esther's cracked lips. The water was cool and clean, and Esther drank greedily, a low moan of relief escaping her throat. Kia gently wiped her face with a damp cloth, her touch infinitely tender. Kuruk finally turned his attention to the reverend, and the terrified crowd gathered behind him. He began to speak, his voice low, but carrying with absolute authority across the silent square. Lonan, still holding Esther, translated his father's words, his own voice tight with controlled anger. "He asks," Lonan began, his eyes sweeping over the faces of the townspeople, "what kind of people are you? What God do you serve that teaches you to punish kindness with torture?" Reverend Blackwood sputtered, "She broke our laws. She gave aid to—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence under the weight of Kuruk's stare. "She gave food to a hungry woman and child," Lonan's translation continued, his voice cutting through the reverend's excuse. "She showed honor when you showed none. The Nonde, the people understand honor. We understand debt. My wife and my son would have gone another day without food if not for her. A debt was created. We came to see how her people honored her for this act. We find you have none. You have treated her like a diseased dog." A wave of shame, mingled with fear, washed over some of the faces in the crowd. Others, like Prescott, just looked on with hatred. Kuruk spoke again, his voice softer now, but no less powerful. Lonan translated, but this time his gaze was on Esther, who was slowly regaining some semblance of awareness in his arms. "He says this is not a home for you," Lonan said, his voice losing its hard edge. "A person's worth is not measured by the laws they obey, but by the strength of their spirit. Your spirit is strong, but it will die in this place. These people will crush it under the weight of their fear. Kuruk took a step closer. Therefore, a choice is offered, Lonan translated. You have no family here. You have no one to protect you. We will be your family. We will be your protection. Come with us. Live with the Nonde. We will teach you our ways. You will have a home where kindness is not a crime. This is how we will repay the debt. The offer hung in the air, stunning and impossible. The entire town stared, mouths agape. Leave with them? Go into the wilderness with savages? It was unthinkable. Esther, held securely in Lonan's arms, slowly lifted her head. She looked past Kuruk's impassive face to the crowd. She saw the Reverend's righteous fury, Martha Blackwood's cold contempt, Walter Prescott's sneering hatred. She saw the fear and judgment on a dozen other faces. She then looked back at the Apache. She saw Kia's gentle, concerned eyes. She saw the quiet strength in Lonan, the man who was holding her with such care. She saw the stern but undeniable integrity in the chief, Kuruk. In Providence, her future was a barren road leading to more servitude, more scorn, and a slow, lonely death of the soul. With them, the future was a terrifying unknown, a leap into a world she could not imagine. But it was a future. It was a choice. And for the first time in her life, she felt the power of making one for herself. Her voice was a dry, rasping whisper, but it was clear. Yes, she said, I will go. A collective gasp went through the town. The Reverend took a step forward as if to protest, but the silent, unblinking stares of a dozen warriors stopped him cold. Kuruk nodded once, a gesture of finality. He turned and swung himself onto his horse. Lonan, still carrying Esther, walked to his own mount. With an effortless display of strength, he settled her in front of him on the saddle, holding her securely against his chest. Her head lolled back against his shoulder, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion, but she was safe. Without a backward glance, the Apache turned their horses and rode out of Providence, leaving the townspeople standing in the dust, silenced by an act of justice and mercy they could not comprehend. As they cleared the last of the buildings, Esther felt the last of her strength fade, and she fell into a deep, healing sleep. The rhythmic gait of the horse and the solid presence of the man holding her, the only realities in a world that had just been irrevocably changed. The journey to the rancheria, the Apache encampment, was a blur to Esther. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her world a patchwork of sensations, the warmth of the sun on her face, the gentle rocking of the horse, the taste of water that Kia frequently offered, the steadfast arm of Lonan around her waist. Whenever she woke, Kia was there, tending to her with a quiet efficiency that was profoundly comforting. She cleaned and dressed Esther's blistered skin with a cool, soothing salve made from herbs, her touch gentle on Esther's bruised wrists. Lonan remained a silent, watchful guardian, his presence a shield against the harshness of the world she was leaving behind. They traveled for 2 days, moving deep into a landscape of red rock canyons and high, pine-studded mesas that was more beautiful than any place Esther had ever seen. The air was clean and sharp, scented with cedar and dust. It was a world away from the cramped, judgmental confines of Providence. When they finally arrived at the encampment, nestled in a wide, grassy valley by a clear running stream, Esther was awake and lucid, though still terribly weak. It was nothing like the primitive, chaotic image she had held in her mind. It was a community. Wickiups, domed dwellings made of brush and hide, were scattered among the cottonwood trees. The air was filled with the sounds of life children laughing, women talking as they worked on hides, the distant nicker of horses. It was a place of purpose and connection. Lonan carried her from his horse to his family's wickiup, a space larger than the attic she had called home. Kia helped her lie down on a soft bed of buffalo robes and gave her a warm, savory broth that slowly rekindled the life in her. For days, she did little more than sleep and eat, her body and spirit mending under Kia's patient care. The little boy, whose name she learned was Ashki, would sometimes peek in at her, his dark eyes wide with curiosity, before Kia would shoo him gently away. As her strength returned, Esther began to take in her new surroundings. This life was governed by seasons and needs, not by the clock and the church bell. The people worked hard, but there was a rhythm and a grace to it. She watched the women scrape and tan deer hides until they were as soft as butter, their hands moving with an inherited knowledge. She watched them weave intricate baskets from yucca fibers and grind corn on stone metates. There was no idleness, but there was no sense of joyless toil either. There was dignity in the work. She was an object of curiosity, of course, the strange, pale-skinned woman who had been brought by the chief, but there was no malice in their stares, only questions. Kia was her bridge to this new world. Through gestures and a growing collection of shared words, Kia began to teach her. She showed Esther how to find edible roots, how to sew with an awl and sinew, how to grind mesquite beans into flour. Esther, who had only ever known the drudgery of the rectory, found a surprising satisfaction in learning these essential skills. Her hands, once soft from polishing silver, grew calloused and capable. Lonan remained a reserved presence. He was a hunter, often gone for days at a time, returning with deer or antelope slung over his horse. When he was in the camp, he was quiet, observing her with his intense, thoughtful eyes. He rarely spoke to her directly, but she felt his protective gaze on her often. The bond between them was unspoken, forged in the crucible of her ordeal and his family's intervention. It was a connection built on a foundation of mutual respect, not words. She respected his strength and the quiet honor that had compelled him to act. He, in turn, seemed to respect the resilience he had witnessed in her. One evening, as the sun set and the cooking fires glowed like fallen stars across the valley, she sat with Kia outside the wickiup. Esther was mending a tear in one of Ashki's small buckskin shirts, her stitches growing more even with practice. "You are good with a needle now," Kia said, her English halting but clear. She had been learning words from Esther, just as Esther was learning words of the Apache. Esther smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that felt new on her face. "You are a good teacher." "Your home," Kia began, her expression serious. "Providence. You do not miss it?" Esther looked down at the shirt in her hands. She thought of the dust, the cold silence of the rectory, the hateful faces in the square. She thought of the pillory. "That was not my home," she said softly. "It was just a place I was kept. My home was gone a long time ago." She looked up, meeting Kia's gaze. I think I am finding it again here." Kia's face softened, and she placed a warm hand on Esther's arm. In that simple gesture, Esther felt the solid truth of family, a connection she had thought lost to her forever. Months turned into a year. The seasons cycled, and Esther's transformation was complete. The haunted, pale girl from Providence was gone. In her place was a strong young woman, her skin tanned by the sun, her hair braided thick and long. She moved with a confidence and purpose that came from knowing her own worth. She could track a rabbit, find water, and speak the language of the Ndé with a growing fluency. She had found not just a refuge, but a life. Her relationship with Lonan had deepened from a silent understanding into a quiet companionship. They would sometimes walk by the stream in the evenings, the space between them comfortable, filled with a shared history and a budding affection. He told her stories of the stars, the people's names for the constellations. She told him about her parents, about their dream of a farm, sharing the memories that she had once held close as painful secrets. In his quiet listening, her grief found a place to rest. One afternoon, she was sitting with Kia and Ashki under a cottonwood tree, teaching the little boy a string game her father had once shown her. Her laughter, free and unrestrained, echoed in the warm air. Lonan approached, returning from a hunt, a brace of rabbits hanging from his belt. He stopped and watched them for a moment, a rare, soft smile touching his lips as he saw the easy joy on Esther's face. She looked up and met his eyes. In that look, Everything that had remained unspoken between them was finally said. There was gratitude, respect, and a deep, abiding tenderness that promised a future. She looked out from the shade of the tree, across the vibrant, sun-drenched valley. She saw the majestic, red rock canyons that had once seemed so alien and intimidating. Now they were the walls of her home. The wind that whispered through the pines no longer sounded like a thing grieving, it sounded like a promise. The act of kindness that had earned her condemnation and torture, an act born from the depths of her own desolation, had been a seed. Here, in this unlikely soil, it had been returned to her 100-fold, blossoming into the one thing she had never expected to find again, a place to belong.